So my name's Chloe. I'm the president of Cornell Students for Animal Rights, and we're hosting this event today with Cornell Vegan Society. We're really excited to introduce our speaker today, Earthling Ed Winters. Earthling Ed, yeah. Earthling Ed is a vegan educator, public speaker, and content creator based in London, England. He's the co-founder and co-director of Surge, an animal rights organization determined to create a world where compassion towards all non-human animals is the norm. In 2016, Surge founded the official Animal Rights March, which grew from 2,500 to 28,000 participants in 2 years. In 2017, Winters produced the documentary Land of Hope and Glory and launched the ongoing moving activism project, the Big Vegan Activism Van. He has spoken at over 1/3 of UK universities and has given speeches all across the world. It is my honor to introduce Earthling Ed.
I want to start by saying thank you to Chloe, thank you to Joshua, and thank you to everyone involved in the Cornell Vegan Society and the animal rights at Cornell as well for putting this event on and for being so gracious as to invite me and to host this talk. I really appreciate it, so thank you so much to both of you. Yeah. I also want to extend a warm gratitude to all of you for showing up today and for coming to listen. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you find what I have to say has been somewhat thought-provoking at the very least. And I think it's important to mention at the beginning that the topics and themes that I'm going to discuss are not there to make you feel guilty, not consciously. And they're not there to say that you're a bad person or that I think you're a bad person if you're not vegan, because that's not fair of me to say that, and I also don't believe it to be true. But I want what I say today to maybe put a few thoughts in your mind that you've not considered before, and maybe make you question things that you've never, ever thought to question before as well. And so I think in all fairness and to be transparent, it's important to start with by saying that I wasn't born vegan, and I wasn't born vegetarian. And there's a notion that people who were kind of outspoken about veganism must have always been vegan, because if you weren't, then why would you care about it so much? But I was brought up in a family that ate meat, dairy, and eggs 3 times a day and never questioned it. In fact, being vegetarian was pretty much a joke around our dinner table. And one of the earliest memories I ever have of vegetarianism, so to speak, was when I was about 12 years old, and I was in an English literature class at school. My teacher brought up being vegetarian for some reason, and I was like 12 or 13, so I was a bit arrogant, a bit boisterous, and so I put my hand up in the air like this, and she was like, "Yes, Edward." And I said, "All vegetarians are pale, weak, and skinny," all right? Which is ironic, because I was the palest, weakest, and skinniest, right? Still not so good. But I didn't really understand that at the time, and the whole class kind of froze a little bit. And so behind me, sat diagonally, was a girl called Natasha. And so I turned to look at Natasha, because she was vegetarian. And I thought, she'll get it. Like, she's vegetarian, she's gonna understand this. And so I looked at her, and she looked back at me with such menace. Like, she was angry. And at that time, I was like, hang on a minute, I don't understand why she's angry. I thought I was going to say, all vegetarians are pale, weak, and skinny, and the teacher would go, congratulations, correct answer. And I would like bask in the glory of it, but that's not what happened. It's kind of weird that memory sticks out in my mind. I mean, I was young, and I did so many things that were silly and said so many silly things at that point, but that, for some reason, sticks out in my mind. I think the reason it sticks out in my mind is it reinforces so much about how we are raised and how society and family really dictate what we believe to be true and what we perceive to be true. Now, at that point, I believed that vegetarians were all pale, weak, and skinny because that's what I'd been told. Why would I ever question that? I mean, if that's what I'm raised to believe, why would I stop and second think myself? I mean, I didn't know what vegans were at that point, and neither did my family, but believe me, they would have been the laughing stock of our house if we did know. But I thought to myself, well, when I reflect back, I think to myself, wow, that really does demonstrate just how powerful that information we're told when we're young really is, and how it sets a precedent for how we will perceive the world and see our actions when we grow up. And so about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago now, I was buying pizza with a friend. Now, I wasn't vegetarian, definitely wasn't vegan, but my friend was vegetarian at this point. And so I said to him, should we get bacon on the pizza? And he looked at me and said, no. I was so outraged. And I said, what are you talking about? What do you mean no? Why wouldn't we want to get bacon on the pizza? I mean, can you even call pizza pizza if there's no bacon on top? And he said, Ed, I don't think an animal should die for a pizza topping. What? What do you mean shouldn't die for a pizza topping? That's why we give pigs life. I mean, we give them life, they give us bacon. What's the point of a pig if it's not for bacon? We breed them for that purpose. But he said no. And so he didn't get bacon on the pizza. Such a strange little thing, because I'd never considered why someone wouldn't want to eat animal products. I'd never considered why I shouldn't eat animal products. But in that moment, it was raised to me that this is something that maybe we should question. I didn't question it at that time, though. I carried on. I was angry. I was frustrated. It was about 4 years ago, I came across this story. Actually, it was 5 years ago now. A story in the BBC News. It was an online piece, and it was talking about a truck carrying 6,000 chickens crashing on the way to a slaughterhouse. And now, the notion of it being chickens was quite pertinent because KFC was my favorite food at that time. I used to go to KFC so often. I had a KFC just a little walk down the road from where I used to live. And so I'd go in there pretty much every single week, always order the same thing, Zinger box meal. And they knew me by my name in there because I was such a regular customer. So sometimes I'd walk through the door, and if it was the staff that knew me, they'd go, oh, hi, Ed, do you want your Zinger box meal? I'd be like, yes, please, as quick as you possibly can. You see, it was just integrated into my life. I never thought about chickens as an animal. I never thought about chickens having the capacity to suffer or feel pain or even having any moral consideration or right to life. But this story really shocked me because the journalist said that 1,500 birds died on the impact of the road traffic accident alone. 1,500 lives just taken in the blink of an eye. But that's not really what upset me the most. Because what upset me more was the fact that there were hundreds, potentially even thousands more of these animals who were alive, but they had broken bones and broken wings and broken combs and broken beaks, and they were bleeding out on the side of the road, and they were suffering. And I acknowledged that they were suffering. And so in that moment, I made an incredibly simple realization, which is that the animals that I consumed had the capacity to suffer and feel pain. And because they can suffer and feel pain, they therefore have a preference to avoid these feelings and emotions. But then there I was, paying for them, to have these things done against their will. And I thought, well, what happens when they reach the slaughterhouse? Because that's where they were going. And so I had a look into it, and I saw what happens to them. They're hung upside down, dragged through an electrified water bath, then they have their throats cut. And I thought, wow, for the ones who died in the accident instantly, that was probably the best way for them to die. I mean, that's preferable to being taken to the slaughterhouse and having all of these horrible things happen to them. So if I was one of those chickens, I'd have been grateful to have died in that situation because my suffering would be somewhat alleviated. But I thought that's so backwards because I'm paying for these animals to be taken to a slaughterhouse where I've just acknowledged they suffer and die, and I wouldn't want that. And so I was faced with this really uncomfortable feeling. It's this weird, uneasy feeling. Because in my fridge was KFC, the Zinger box meal from the night before. So the question I had to ask myself is, well, do I acknowledge something that I've repressed or haven't thought about, but then carry on? Bury my head in the sand and just try and get over that uneasy feeling, or do I recognize the hypocrisy in my life? The hypocrisy of saying, I love animals, but I pay for animals to suffer and die, and then change. And so at that point I changed, but it was only to vegetarian, because I didn't think animals suffered and died in the dairy and egg industries. And so I was veggie for about 8 months, and then I was shown a documentary called Earthlings, and that changed my life, because it made me realize the systematic abuse of animals and how it transcends just further than food and even dairy and eggs, but actually is encompassing of the clothes we wear, the products we buy to wash ourselves and do our hair, the entertainment we go. I mean, I used to go to zoos. I loved going to zoos because I loved animals. And I'd stand outside the lion enclosure, look through the glass, I'd see the lions pacing up and down, and I'd say, wow, isn't nature beautiful? But no sense of irony, because that's what I saw, and that's what I was told to see. But I watched this film, and it completely changed my perception of how non-human animals live, but also, more importantly, how I should deem their purpose in this world. And so again, I was faced with that question, because I had a little companion animal hamster at the time. His name was Rupert, and I loved Rupert so dearly. And so after, he was so sweet. And after the documentary finished, I went and sat next to him, and I had him, and he was running over my hands and my arms. And I looked at him, and I thought to myself, here's Rupert, right? An individual. And I recognize as an individual because he loves broccoli but hates kale, which was ironically a bit like me, actually. So here's Rupert, with his own likes and dislikes, his own personality. He's an individual. I recognize him as a someone. But at the same time, I'm paying for animals who are just like Rupert in every way that matters, to suffer and die on my behalf, for all of these different areas that I just take for granted and never think of. So that question came back. Do I bury my head in the sand, pretend to ignore what I now know, or do I make a simple change? And so at that point, I did make a simple change. But that change was to vegan, thankfully. And so that's kind of led me to where I am today. And so I did a whole bunch of research into this because people started asking me questions. And one thing I realized very quickly is there's 101 different excuses to not be vegan. And so I thought, wow, I should probably get learning some of these things. And so I tried to involve veganism as a moral philosophy within my own life. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is related to moral philosophy and moral arguments. And so I think we have to set some sort of foundation, some framework for kind of what would be deemed as some suitable form of moral thinking. And so it's important that when we apply moral ideas to arguments that we make sure those ideas are non-arbitrary, but more importantly, without contradiction, or as far as is possible, without contradiction, in the sense they can be applied in a variety of different situations and circumstances and still hold the truth, the element of veracity that we're looking for when we make moral arguments. And so let me explain an idea. So if we position humans as a species deserving of moral consideration, because we say, well, as humans, we're sentient, we're conscious, and we can feel pain and suffer, and therefore we should not be exploited against our will. To be non-contradictory, we must include non-human animals into our circle of moral consideration, because they too are conscious, sentient, can feel pain, and have an experience of life that's individualistic to them. And so we can see, to begin with, how these ideas become somewhat distorted, because often we place ourselves at a higher level, and in many ways humans do have a superiority. But the argument I'm going to make today is that that superiority is irrelevant when deeming worth of life. And so let's go through a few examples of arguments. And let's look at culture and tradition and the power of an idea. So let's take an idea, a simple idea, and let's push that idea into society. And over time, that idea becomes a societal norm. Now, if you keep fueling societal norms, over time, they form part of society's culture. And if you pass cultures on generation to generation, over time, they form traditions. And so often we say, well, it's morally justifiable to use animals because they form part of our culture and can be used in our traditions. We look at Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, whatever the event may be. And we say, well, it's justifiable to do so because it's intrinsically related to our identity and our traditions. And so let's apply this way of thinking to a few different scenarios. And let's first start with a human situation. Let's look at female genital mutilation, which is a cultural practice. And it's very much a traditional practice. But is it a moral practice? I think we'd argue not. What about a situation with non-human animals? Let's look at the Yulin Dog Meat Festival, a festival that happens every single year in an area of China where they kill tens of thousands of dogs and cats. What about in Boknal, South Korea, where they have a dog meat trade? Is that moral because it's cultural? What about in Japan, where every single year they capture or kill hundreds of dolphins? It's a traditional practice. Is it therefore moral? What about in the Faroe Islands, where every single year they slaughter thousands or hundreds at least of pilot whales? Again, is that moral because it's cultural or traditional? You see, if we want to argue that using animals is morally justifiable because we can use them in our traditions and our cultures, we have to apply that without contradiction, which means that any cultural and traditional action becomes morally justifiable simply because it's cultural and traditional. So is female genital mutilation moral? No, of course not. So we can't excuse using animals by pointing to those reasons alone. And I found it a bit jarring because last year there was the Winter Olympics on, and they were on in South Korea. And there was a calling for the boycott of the Winter Olympics. People were saying the athletes shouldn't go and compete. And I thought, my goodness, what's happened in South Korea that warrants such an idea? It's because they have a dog meat trade. Hang on a second. They're asking these Olympians to not go and compete because they kill dogs in South Korea. Well, that seems a bit jarring to me. But even more jarring, some of the Olympians who went, they went to a dog meat farm and rescued some of the dogs and brought them back to where they were staying. The press loved it. They called them animal rights heroes, animal saviors. But they went back to where they were staying with these rescued dogs and ate cows and pigs and chickens and sheep and salmon and tuna and all the animals that we consume without granting a second thought to. in our society? It seems so strange to me. Like we drop these arbitrary distinctions between species of animals based on something that's entirely superfluous, like whether or not we regard them as pets, or whether or not we see them as cute and cuddly. But again, looking at issues of morality must be non-arbitrary, which means that our distinction between species, again, doesn't draw a good enough moral comparison because it's entirely non-arbitrary. So let's continue. Because what does give us the right? I mean, that's a question I often ask. What gives us the right? As a species, but also as individuals, what gives us the right to point the finger and say, you're in the slaughterhouse and you're to be loved in a home? What gives us the right to say, your destiny is in a fur farm and your destiny is to be loved in a home? How do you make these distinctions? What moral justification can we use? And I guess the point would be, what has higher value? This is a question I'll come back to a few times. What has higher value, taste or life? Taste or life? Because let's move this argument on further. And let's look at personal choice and sensory pleasure as justifications. Now, sometimes people will say to me, I have no problem with you being vegan, no issue at all, but can you please not force your views and just respect my personal choice to not be vegan? I mean, I'm granting you that respect, now grant me that respect. Now, every action that we make, whether that action would deem to be moral or immoral, is a personal choice. I mean, let's think about it. We can go to a shelter, rescue a dog, bring them home and abuse them ourselves. That's a personal choice that we've chosen to make. We could leave tonight, find someone on the street and mug them. That's a personal choice, not moral. It's not justifiable just because we personally choose to make that action. So when we cite personal choice as a justifier, I mean, what are we citing, really? And furthermore, one of the reasons I went vegan was for personal choice. The personal choice of the trillions of animals, and it is trillions, who are killed every single year entirely needlessly, who, if granted their choice, would just like to live their life without human-inflicted exploitation. So again, when we cite personal choice, whose personal choice are we thinking of other than our own? And let's remember that animals don't willfully walk into the slaughterhouse. They're forced there against their will, which means any notion of choice has been removed for them. And what about taste? This always comes up. It's one of the reasons I used to eat meat, dairy, and eggs, was because I loved how they tasted. I'd say, this is my favorite food. I could never be vegan because I could never give up cheese. Oh, I loved halloumi. That was my big one. Halloumi, brie, camembert, red Leicester, you name it, I loved it. But is taste a good enough moral justification? Or, to broadly put it, is sensory pleasure a good enough moral justification? You see, the thing is, if we justify using animals because they fulfill some sensory pleasure, then again, to be non-contradictory, we have to say that anything that causes anyone sensory pleasure can automatically be morally justified simply because it causes someone pleasure. I don't need to give too many examples for us to realize where there could be some sort of problem in that way of thinking. And so again, what has higher value? Taste or life? What gives us the right? What about an appeal to nature? Let's look at the food chain. How about that? Because often people say, well, actually, I understand some of the points you're saying, but you're forgetting about the fact that we as humans exist within this animal kingdom. They say, oh, well, you acknowledge that we're animals, well, therefore, why are we being held accountable over other animals in the wild? After all, lions eat meat, and our ancestors used to eat meat as well, and you wouldn't be alive today if your ancestors didn't eat meat. So we make these appeal to nature fallacies, and so let's look at a few of those. Now, food chains are, of course, incredibly important. They help maintain population sizes of animals. They help form ecosystems, and fundamentally, they help maintain and balance the natural ecology. But what we do to animals when we selectively breed them and genetically modify them, when we artificially inseminate them and forcibly impregnate them, when we take their babies away from them, when we mutilate them by chopping off their tails, cutting out their teeth, castrating them, dehorning them, disbudding them, when we exploit them for what they produce for their own species, like their milk and their eggs, and when we load them into trucks and trailers, take them to a slaughterhouse where we hang them upside down, cut their throats, and bleed them to death, it has nothing to do with any notion of a natural order. And importantly, it fits none of the criteria required to be labeled as a food chain. You see, the food chain that we cite is a human-made construct, conveniently created to try and justify what is an entirely unnecessary act. It's an appeal to nature fallacy that ignores the complexity and interdependent web of life that form natural ecosystems. It overlooks the fact that as humans, we have moral agency. Now, as moral agency, what that basically means is that we are able to make decisions based on a notion of right and wrong. But importantly, we can be held accountable for the decisions that we make. And we should be held accountable for the decisions that we make. Imagine a society where no one was held accountable. What kind of society would that be? In fact, the cornerstone of a civilized contemporary society is the very idea that we hold each other accountable and responsible for the actions that we make, and we strive to be better, and we strive to progress morally and more sophisticatedly as a species as well. In essence, often when we make the food chain argument, it's like a might makes right kind of philosophy. The idea that because we physically can exploit someone, we're somehow justified to do so. But again, we don't apply that to any other aspect of our life. Just because we can physically harm someone doesn't mean that we're somehow justified to do it. And what about the idea that our ancestors ate meat? Because, of course, that's true. We can't deny it. Our ancestors ate meat, and if they didn't, we probably wouldn't be alive today. I can't dispute that. But why do we base our morality on the actions of a primitive society, where modern-day notions of right and wrong cease to exist, and where in the absence of choice, eating meat was a necessity for survival? And what about the idea that animals eat other animals? I mean, just because a lion kills a gazelle doesn't mean we're then justified to go to Target and buy a steak. Lions are obligate carnivores, meaning they kill out of necessity. Like I've said before, we don't. And similar to before, why would we base our morality on the actions of wild animals who are regularly documented doing things that we would never deem to be acceptable or moral in a contemporary and moral society? So again, what gives us the right? This is kind of the rabbit hole I went down, where I really didn't want to be vegan for such a long time. And so I thought there's going to be something I'm going to come across. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to find that one holy grail of an argument that makes me go, yes, now I can consume animal products. I'm still looking for that one. So let's continue. Because I want to do a couple of little ideas. And so we make an appeal to nature fallacy, so let's kind of continue with that strain of thought. And let's say, well, okay, I'm going to bring a live pig into the room now. A little pig, maybe 4, 5, 6 months old. And the pig's running around amongst you all, down by your feet, and you can pet the pig and everything. And I say, okay then, right, so let's be honest and truthful with ourselves, and let's kill this pig. Because, some of us might go home tonight and eat bacon, so let's kill the pig right now and save us the hassle of having to go to the supermarket. Would any of you volunteer to do so? I put a little caveat in there, actually, because I'm going to be a little bit more awkward. And I'm going to say that you have to kill the pig using what you're biologically given. So your claws and your canines. I mean, if we're naturally designed to eat animals, first of all, we would be able to do it easily, but we'd be able to do it kind of what we're given biologically. And so you may say, well, that's fair enough, Ed, but, we have our brains, right? And our brains have allowed us to develop tools and allowed us to develop machinery that means that we don't have to rely on these crude tools. We can actually do it another way, but does that mean that we're meant to? I mean, we can fly because we've developed planes using our brains, but are we naturally and biologically meant to fly? No, I don't think so. I mean, I try, but it never works, right? And so the idea that our brains have allowed us to do something doesn't mean that that idea is somehow entrenched into something that we should do or is natural or even moral for us to do. But let's say you're trying to kill this pig, and you're going to take me up on my challenge. Now, pigs love belly rubs, right? And if anyone's ever spent any time with pigs, you can probably vouch for this. And so when you're trying to maul that pig, the pig probably rolls over and gives a little oink oink as you rub their belly. Okay, but now you've killed the pig. I'm going to give you that. You've killed the pig, and now the carcass of the pig is open in front of you, and there's the meat. So are you going to eat the raw meat? What about the intestines and the feces inside the intestines and the organs and the tendons and the ligaments and the cartilage? Are you going to eat those bits as well? Are you going to eat around those bits? Something that always strikes me as a little bit strange is that when people sometimes come to terms or see the reality of the animal they're consuming, it puts them off their food. And so to provide you an example, I want to go through a headline. This headline was in the Huffington Post UK. And when I saw it, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And so the headline read, "Student finds dead chicken in their fried chicken box meal." And I thought, whoa, this is interesting, isn't it? I mean, why is this news? I mean, he's gone into, I think it was like Dixie's Chicken or KFC, it's like a fried chicken place. And he's come home with his fried chicken box meal, and lo and behold, there's dead chicken in there. I mean, what did he expect to find? But actually, the pictures illustrated that he'd found pieces of organ in his fried chicken box meal. And so he tweeted, let's say it's KFC, he tweeted at KFC, and he was like, "KFC, how dare you? This is disgusting. There's a piece of brain, I think it might have been kidney, in my fried chicken box meal. How dare you? Can you please explain yourself?" Oh, well, this seems slightly ironic, doesn't it? I mean, the notion is that we've come to terms with something and come across something we didn't want to see, and it somehow puts us off consuming our food. I mean, I hear this a lot with slaughterhouse footage, where I try and show them something from a slaughterhouse, and people will often say to me, "Don't show me that, it'll put me off my food." Why? Why will it put you off your food? Why does seeing the process of how animal products arrive on our plate put us off consuming them? That seems to make absolutely no sense to me. Surely we should be hungry. We should see a cow having their throat cut and we should say, nom nom, that's dinner tonight, but we don't say that. It makes us upset. Often makes us cry. Sometimes it makes us angry, and sometimes we say, who could work in a slaughterhouse? We say, what kind of person could do this day in, day out? But we're the ones going to the supermarket and buying these products. We're the ones asking for these products to be supplied. Yet often I hear, this comes from non-vegans, people passing judgment on those who work in slaughterhouses for doing the acts that we pay for them and ask them to do through our purchases. If we can't watch slaughterhouse footage, if it's not good enough for our eyes, then the question we have to ask ourselves is, why on earth would it ever be good for our stomach? And if we can't watch it, can we claim that it's humane? And let's look at that word humane. And I think when we see phrasing like humane slaughter, we just kind of readily accept it, don't we? But what does it mean, humane slaughter? What does it look like? I mean, first we have to analyze what the word humane means objectively, don't we? Because if we're going to use the word humane slaughter, well, what does it mean? And so the word humane objectively means having or showing compassion or benevolence. Okay? Is the slaughter compassionate? Is the slaughter benevolent? I don't think so. How can you compassionately take the life of someone who doesn't want to die? How can you benevolently take the life of someone who doesn't want to die? Surely humane slaughter is an oxymoron. How can it possibly exist? These animals do not wish to die, nor do they have to die. So is it not disingenuous to place words like humane or compassionate or benevolent in front of them, as if that somehow excludes the fact these animals have a preference to live and suffer in these places, to blind us, the consumer? And that's what we have to understand, is these phrases are there for a very specific purpose, to make us buy a product that if we knew the truth about, we would probably second-guess buying. So I went into the supermarket when I first arrived in the US, and there was a packet, like a box of milk, a carton of milk in there. And it's like Organic Valley, I think is the brand. And so on this kind of carton of milk, you see a dairy cow in a field. Okay, that's not necessarily uncommon to see on packaging, although it isn't common to see in the industry. But more importantly, what offended me more than that was the fact that there was a mother, a human mother, and she's holding her baby. And they're both leaning in towards the dairy cow as if they're somehow going to pet or groom the dairy cow. And so as a consumer, you see this and you go, wow, Organic Valley is very idyllic. Family farming. I love family farming. All my animal products come from family farms where the animals are well looked after. This is the kind of product I want to buy. That's the idea it gives us, a romanticized picture of what animal farming looks like. It's very insidious and sinister, because in the dairy industry, dairy cows will only produce milk to feed their children. And so when the child has been born, the dairy farm will take the baby away from their mother. And so all of a sudden this carton of milk has a picture of a human mother and her child leaning into a dairy cow, a mother cow, whose baby has been taken away from her. Taunting. That's what I see. A form of taunting. Because the reality is this mother cow will never know the maternal bond that the human in front of her is feeling with her own child. What about the notion of free range? I used to buy free range eggs all the time. Even before I was vegetarian, I'd always buy free range eggs because I thought caging animals was horrible. And a lot of us believe that. Vegan or non-vegan, we say, it's wrong to cage animals, so I buy free-range eggs. Okay, so what does free-range eggs, what does that mean? So we go into a supermarket. We see a box of free-range eggs. And so we see that word free, freedom, right? And so what we do is we add our idea, our connotations of freedom onto that box of eggs. And so freedom to us means living a natural life, doing what we want to do, right? Having friends, family, whatever. But most importantly, it means living a life without pain, without fear, without suffering, without exploitation. So we see that box of eggs, and we see those hens must have lived a good life. The word free is there. They must have done what comes naturally to them. They must have spent time with their friends and family if that's what they want to do. But importantly, we say they have lived a life without pain, without fear, without suffering, without exploitation. But do we actually believe that to be true? Do we believe that these animals who are commodified for the product they produce live a life without exploitation or suffering? What does free range actually look like? Okay? Well, think about it this way. Only the female hens will produce eggs, because producing eggs is a female reproductive system. And so the male chicks won't produce eggs. And so when they're born into a hatchery, what happens is the males and females are separated. And the males will never grow to be the same size as the chickens that we kill for meat, meaning they're useless. They're not profitable. No one can make any money from their bodies. So what happens as soon as they're born is they're thrown into a conveyor belt. This conveyor belt will lead them to a macerator, a grinder, where they're ground up alive as soon as they're born. Or they're thrown into a gas chamber and killed using CO2 as soon as they're born, simply because they won't produce eggs. And so what happens to the hens who escape the macerator? Well, they're debeaked. They have the beaks taken off. And they're taken to barns. Now in the UK, I don't know the statistics for the US, but in the UK, a farmer can legally house 16,000 birds per free-range barn, which means he can house 9 birds per square meter of space. That's free range. In essence, you take the animals out of lots of small cages and you put them in one massive cage. It's the same principle, but it sounds good. Cage-free, we see that all the time. Makes us want to buy the product, makes us see something we wish to see, which is life of freedom. But that's not true. And so what happens to the hens when they're no longer producing enough eggs to be profitable? Well, they're sent to the slaughterhouse, and they're killed by being hung upside down and having a knife pulled across their throat. Does that sound like freedom to you? Does that sound like free, what we would want if we wanted to be free? And so what about dairy? I touched a little bit on about dairy, but one thing I often hear in the UK, and maybe it's the same here, is happy cows produce happy milk. It's one thing that farmers say. We love our animals because we need happy cows, because happy cows produce a good quality form of milk. They produce good milk, and we want the consumers to have good milk. So let's go through standard dairy farming, and let's decipher whether or not what happens is happy, or whether the word happy can be used in connotation with what happens in standardized dairy farming. And so, like we said before, dairy cows will only produce milk to feed their children, which means they're forcibly impregnated. So question 1, are the cows happy when they're restrained and forcibly impregnated? Question 2, are the cows happy when their baby is taken away from them? Are the mother cows happy when the baby is taken away from them? Question number 3, are they happy when they're hooked up to machines and exploited for what they naturally produce for their young? Are they happy when the truck or trailer comes for them one day, when they're no longer profitable enough? Are they happy when they're loaded into the truck or trailer? Are they happy when they're taken to the slaughterhouse? Are they happy when the bolt gun is placed against their skull and the knife pulled across their throat? Again, make no mistake, there's no happiness in the dairy industry. These industries seek to make money from us. They operate solely on supply and demand, meaning what we buy is crucial to determining whether or not they survive as an industry, which means they need us to buy the products. It's not going to show you the truth or tell you the reality. And those adverts on TV are not going to show you what actually happens to the animals, because if they did, we would be absolutely outraged. And rightfully so, because we understand these animals suffer and we feel their suffering. So we turn on the TV and we see an advert for Wendy's, and what do we see? We see the glamorization, the sexualization of meat. We equate masculinity with meat eating and femininity with milk drinking. They play on our fears of identity, the fears of who we want to be. And so you connotate meat with masculinity. You make veganism seem like an action for someone who's not masculine and is weak. And you tell people that soy has estrogen in it and feminizes people. But the estrogen in soy is called phytoestrogen. It's a plant hormone. The estrogen in cow's milk is mammalian estrogen. It's the estrogen that's found in mammals. And so does not seem slightly peculiar that we connotate a plant hormone as being somewhat destructive, but the hormone that's found in mammalian milk is somehow being fine? Again, they tout lies to pull the blinds across our eyes, to make us not question, to make us doubt what we're told by those who seek to end animal suffering, and to make us perpetuate the system we've always bought into. So they make us buy these products by connotating these products with something that we find desirable in terms of identity, with who we want to be, with who we desire to be. They sell us the products that we want, but they don't sell us the reality of what happens. They lie to us, they deceive us, they scam us, they manipulate us, but most importantly, they profit from us. And so you think, well, how is this allowed? How can this happen? For example, the dairy industry last year lost $1.1 billion. They went down 10% opposed to the year previous. Do you know what happened? The US government gave them $1 billion in a tax subsidy. $1 billion of taxpayers' money went to an industry that consumers are stopping supporting. How is that fair? There are people on the streets. There are people without food, without home, without shelter. And we give money to an industry that's failing just to prop them up because they're so powerful they can lobby to our governments and demand that something like that happens. Where's the justice? there is no justice. The exploitation occurs at every step of the way. They exploit animals, but they exploit us. They exploit our compassion towards animals by lying to us. And so let's continue down that rabbit hole of moral justification. Where do we end up next? Where do we seek to continue? What about intelligence? Does intelligence define worth of life? Is the fact that we as humans having higher cognitive abilities mean that we're somehow justified to exploit those who have a lower cognitive ability? Well, again, we have to be non-contradictory. Do we apply that way of thinking to humans as well? Is a human with a higher IQ and advanced cognitive abilities worth more than a human with a lower IQ? Of course not. But we must be consistent. And so if we say, of course not, that means that intelligence is not a definer of worth of life. It doesn't prescribe the purpose of a being dependent on how they see the world, or how they live, or how they view, or how intelligent they are. Einstein said a quote once. And the quote said that if you judge the intelligence of a fish by their ability to climb a tree, they will always seem stupid. Meaning that intelligence is, of course, objective. But there are some things that differentiate intelligence between species. Dolphins see sonar. Eagles have a heightened sense of sight. And so, yes, we may have emotional, intellectual capabilities that these non-human animals don't, but they possess traits that we don't have either. And what about the emotional ability to feel pain? Now, do we know that non-human animals feel pain the same way that we do? No. But is it relevant? And here's an idea. One thing we always acknowledge is that non-human animals live in the present. One of the arguments used against veganism is we say, well, non-human animals can't see into the future. They don't fear the future. They don't fear death. That's what makes us intrinsically human, is we can perceive things that we do not yet know. And so we can live outside of the present, so to speak. This is debatable, but let's go with it. And let's say that non-human animals are stuck in the present. Does that not mean that their ability to feel pain could be heightened and intensified because they have an inability to avoid that sensation of pain? The fact they live in the present could mean that their senses are somewhat heightened than ours. When we look at the smell of a dog and the sight of an eagle, and we acknowledge that their senses are heightened. So potentially we could argue the pain an animal feels could potentially be heightened above us. But is it relevant? Well, of course it's not relevant. What relevance does pain have in terms of how we should inflict suffering onto someone else? Suffering is suffering, whether or not we acknowledge it to be wrong, whether we acknowledge it to be heightened or less heightened. It's always going to be wrong. And so we continue. And we look for further justifications and we say, okay, but soy farming is terrible for the environment. Can we prove that veganism is actually better for the environment? Do we know that has been statistically true, or is this just a vegan form of propaganda? And interestingly, vegan propaganda is something that gets thrown at me a lot. They say that I'm touting something that has an agenda and has a bias and has a purpose. But you walk down any streets, you turn on any television, and you see the same thing over and over again. It's not vegan propaganda. It's propaganda from the industries that we see every single day. And one vegan speaks up and we say that they're forcing their views, but we're so closed off to the reality of the world that we fail to see that everywhere we go, views are being forced upon us. To give you another example, I went to Whole Foods, good place for vegans. But I went to Whole Foods and I was stunned. Not surprised, but stunned. Because above the meat aisle, there was a few big words: transparency, traceability. Oh, big words pushed straight into our vision. So we connotate what we see with being traceable and transparent. But another thing that really caught my eye was the word ethical. Now, this wasn't above the meat. This was just in the middle of Whole Foods, the word ethical. And that was just in big words. And so I read all the small writing, and there was a little logo, a little emblem. And it said, and I kid you not, it was like, the Whole Foods Trade Guarantee presented to Whole Foods. They presented themselves with an award. All right? But because they'd done so, they could now put ethical in big block words in the middle of their supermarket. So people walking in saw the word ethical and made a connotation that what they were buying was somehow ethical because that's where the word is. So when we talk about forcing views, what's subliminally happening behind the scenes is to see these products in a way that isn't necessarily representative and isn't necessarily true. And so what is vegan propaganda? And is the environmental consequences somehow a perpetuation of this so-called vegan propaganda? I mean, after all, soy farming is terrible for the environment. This is one of the first things that someone pulled me up on. I just watched this documentary called Cowspiracy. And anyway, I went into university the next day, so I was vegan. And I had a bunch of friends there who were like, pretty liberal, environmentalist-leaning friends. And so I thought, this is going to get them, right? I'm going to go in, I'm going to tell them all about the environmental problems related to animal agriculture, and then they'll get it on the spot. And they'll go vegan, and we'll all eat hummus and falafel and be really happy. Yeah. Spoiler, that didn't happen, but let's see, right? But So I walk into university and I say, guys, I've just seen this documentary called Cowspiracy. It talks all about the environmental problems related to animal agriculture. And I do want to make a little caveat separate to this and say, outside of the context of Cowspiracy, some of the criticisms that are laid against that, when viewed in context of everything else that's coming out from institutions from all around the world, the science behind the environmental consequences of animal agriculture is somewhat no longer a contentious issue. I know that Cowspiracy sometimes draws criticisms, but viewed in the context of everything else, it's undeniable. Anyway, I go into university, and I say, animal agriculture is destroying our environment. And this girl, Rhiannon, she walks over to me, and she goes, that's all well and good, Ed, but soy farming is terrible for the environment. It's destroying the Amazon rainforest. And so I kind of stopped for a moment because I didn't know what to say. I had no idea. And I thought, surely not. Surely my consumption of tofu isn't destroying the environment. And I do want to say, for the record, I am a self-proclaimed soy boy, and I'll wear that badge of honor quite like. Yeah. When people use that as to try and insult me, I'm like, here we go, soy boy. Like, where's the soy milk? Pass it around. So I drink a lot of soy, and I consume soy, is what I'm saying. And so I thought, hang on a minute, this doesn't seem quite right. Surely my consumption of soy milk and tofu isn't responsible for the Amazon rainforest destruction. That seems somewhat ridiculous. And anyway, I went home and I Googled it, and lo and behold, she was right. I thought, my God, no way. Soy farming is destroying the Amazon rainforest. In fact, I think it's 1 million square kilometers of the entire world is consumed just for soy farming, which put into perspective is the size of France, Belgium, Holland, and I think Germany combined just for soy farming. Overwhelming, right? But what they don't tell us is between 70 to 85% of all the soy that is grown is fed to livestock animals. And so I thought, damn, if I'd known that at the time, I could have turned around to her and I could have said, well, Rhiannon, that's a really great point you bring up there. And I'm very grateful for you bringing it up. But are you aware that up to 85% of all the soy that's grown is fed to livestock animals? And obviously in that moment, she'd have turned to me and she'd gone, my God, you're right, I'm going to have to be vegan now, right? No, obviously not. But only 6% of the soy that is grown is used for human consumption. And soy is ubiquitous among most people's diets. It's found in cereals, breads, sauces, chocolates. It's not just a vegan product. You go into any supermarket and pick up basically any product that's not Whole Foodsy, and it's probably got some form of soy in anyway. Basically, I'm saying it's ubiquitous. And so actually the issue of soy in the environment is related directly to the fact that we exploit animals. And so let's continue with the environment, because there was a 5-year study released last year. And this study was the most comprehensive study ever conducted exploring the relationship between farming and the environment. Looked at 40,000 farms in 119 countries, and they concluded several things. The first thing they concluded is that if the world went plant-based, we could reduce the amount of agricultural land we needed by 75%. Wow. Now, 45% of the Earth's total ice-free land currently is consumed by agriculture. And we could reduce this by 3/4 by switching to a plant-based diet. And so sometimes we think, but how can we feed everyone with just plants? That doesn't seem to make any sense. How do we comprehend the scale of how many plants we'll have to produce? But often what we don't realize is that all the animals that we raise have to be fed something, right? And the majority of the time, that's plants. And so we produce so much food to feed to animals who we then kill to consume as food, forgetting the fact that we could just eat the food from the beginning of the process. And so we could reduce all the agricultural land, reduce the agricultural land we needed, and also feed every single hungry mouth on this planet by just switching to a plant-based diet. But importantly, they concluded the single simplest thing that we can do in our day-to-day lives to combat climate change is to become vegan. The most comprehensive study ever conducted on the matter concluded with that statement. Does that seem credible to you? Does that maybe suggest that we have some sort of imperative to act quickly? And so the question I've asked about what has higher value, taste or life, becomes somewhat bigger than that. It becomes what has higher value, taste or the life of an animal, and indeed potentially the life of our planet as well. Where does that sit on the chain of value? And so I've used this word necessity, right? Because I said, if something's not a necessity, can we morally justify it? But I guess we have to work out whether or not eating animal products is a necessity. I mean, do we need meat, dairy and eggs to sustain our healthy life? And so the ADA, which is the American Dietetic Association, is the largest body of diet and nutrition professionals in the US and I think the world. It's formed of over 100,000 certified practitioners, and they've categorically stated that a vegan diet is healthy, safe, and nutritionally adequate for every stage of life, including pregnancy, lactation, and infancy as well, which means that we can survive and even thrive on a plant-based diet, which means we've eliminated the notion of necessity. And so all of these things that we do to animals, and as a consequence to our planet, come not because we have to, Well, why then? Why? If we don't have to cause so much suffering to animals, why do we? What arguments do we have left? What else can we consider? Should we take a practical approach? And do we say, well, what will happen to all the animals if we stop consuming them? We can't just release them into the wild. They'll go crazy and destroy the ecology. That's a valid point. But the industry works in a system of supply and demand, which means as more people go vegan, the number of animals we breed into production will decrease proportionally, meaning we'll never end up with a situation where we have to slaughter all these animals and release them into the wild. So that's not a conundrum. So what then are we left with? And the beautiful thing is if we free up all this agricultural land, we can allow it to rewild. And what does that mean? That means we allow the ecosystems to flourish and come back. The trees, the hedgerows, the forests, the woodlands to restore and replenish. And we allow the population size of animals to also restore and replenish. And we create a more harmonious food chain and symbiotic, harmonious element of nature, which we've destroyed through human intervention. And we can restore some of the environment that we so desperately need to help combat so many of the problems that we're currently facing. So why then? If this is a choice, or we can go into a supermarket and buy a vegan or a non-vegan product, then why do we choose to buy a product that causes suffering and causes so much damage? If it is a choice, then why do we choose to be cruel? Is fundamentally the question that I'm asking you. And so that's kind of the idea I want to leave you with. The idea that actually the choices that we make as individuals have a profound impact. And it may seem inconsequential to us. We just buy something because we've always bought it and it's habitual and routine for us. But actually, what we have to begin to realize is that every purchase that we make has a profound impact, a lot larger than we may conceive. And that the world exists beyond our own noses and beyond what is tangibly in front of us. And something may seem small, it may not seem relevant, but actually, it's the opposite. It has a huge impact. An accumulation of individual impacts creates a systematic change. Because that's something else that we often think. Well, how am I ever going to make a difference? I'm one person, but I live in a world full of billions of people. And if I change, what does that change? But everything good that's happened in this world happened because individuals understood that they had an imperative to change, an imperative to reflect and self-criticize and analyze their own actions. I mean, what is it about our species that makes us so great, but our ability to look at our actions and change accordingly, and the fact we live in a society where we have that abundance of choice and some notion of free will. Free will enough to make us know that we can buy what we want to buy in supermarkets and dictate what's stored and what's supplied there. And so does one person have a difference? Or can one person cause a difference? Of course they can. And to put this into perspective, let's think of ourselves in front of a lake or a river, some pool of water. And I say that we have one drop of water. And you might think to yourself, well, what's one drop of water going to do? I mean, the pond is full of water. Adding an extra drop isn't going to do anything. But we drop that water into the pond, and it forms a ripple. That ripple grows larger and larger and larger, and all of a sudden that one drop of water, which may seem insignificant and inconsequential, has changed the landscape of the pond that we are looking at. That times that drop of water by 100, and you have 100 times the impact. Every drop of water is individual, but together it forms a huge impact. Now, think of yourself as a drop of water, and think of the world as a pond. And so we may not feel that we can bring about significant change, but actually we can change how the world looks by the choices that we make and the decisions that we make, and also how we perceive the life of others around us. And so is it time for us to consider non-human animals into our circle of moral consideration, to understand that it's not how we exploit them, but the fact that we have a mentality that allows us to exploit them that is the problem? Is it time for us to reevaluate our relationship with them and to understand that they coexist on this planet with us, not for us? Their life is not here for us to use or to exploit in the same way that our lives are not here for someone else to use or exploit. Autonomy is something we hold so intrinsically valuable to ourselves. But why do we deny autonomy to others who, in all the ways that matter, are the same as us? Like I said before, sentient, conscious, can feel, have individualistic experiences of life that define how they live their life. What unites us is what is paramount. And the bits that separate us, of course, are important, but in the issue of moral consideration, are completely arbitrary. And so with the choice that we have, and with the fact that we can leave now and we can do whatever we want with our life, but importantly, we can leave and research and look into our actions and make a change. Because one thing I want to say to you is don't believe a word said. Don't believe a word. Think that I'm wrong. Think that I'm lying. Go home and prove it. Prove it yourself. Go home and research and see if the way I describe the egg industry and the dairy industry is true. Go home and see if you can find a justification that morally allows us to do these things to animals. That's what I tried to do. I couldn't find anything. And so to be logically honest and morally honest, I made that change. And so the question I'll ask you is if you do some research and you find the same conclusions that I found and that every vegan in this room has found, what will you do with that information? Will you continue to bury your head in the sand and pretend that your actions don't have a consequence that affects others? Or will you understand that suffering is involved with the purchases that we make? And because there's a victim, there's a moral obligation for us to change. Thank you so much for listening. So we're going to do Q&A now for like 50 minutes, I think, right? Is that right? Which is great. So if you have a question, then we have a microphone. Cool. If anyone has any questions, then let's go for anything you want. And there's a question.
Hello.
Hello.
So my question is, if you're in a relationship with a non-vegan, can you please give some tips for how to navigate that? And
oh my goodness. I've never faced that dilemma. I've always been in a relationship with my girlfriend, and we went vegan together. So I've never faced that conundrum. But I imagine it's a bad one. So I think we can relate this to right. Okay, but I think we can relate this to a bigger one. So the question really becomes like, how do we deal with like non-vegan friends and family? Is fundamentally like the broader point of the question. I feel the same too. So that's what the question becomes. Like, how do we relate veganism when we have friends and family who aren't vegan? And so this is a difficult situation. This is a difficult thing for me to describe because it's kind of like a situation of do as I say, not as I do, in the sense of that my family aren't vegan. And so I'll give you a little bit of context to my personal situation, and then I'll bring it on to what I would recommend or what I would suggest as being good ideas. So my family aren't vegan. And so about, 3 years ago, I sent my mum and my dad an email. I've been vegan just over 4 years. And so I'd been vegan for a year, and they knew it, but I'd never really spoken to them about it. And so about 3 years ago, I thought, I'm going to send them an email, because apparently phone calls are overrated, right? So I'm going to send them an email, because I thought this is going to way to get the information across. And so it was like, hi, Mum, hi, Dad. They're both separated and remarried, so it was 2 separate emails. Hi, Mum, hi, Dad. I'm vegan, I'm vegan, and I want to tell you I want to tell you the reasons I'm vegan. So I did a little paragraph on like ethics of the animals, paragraph of the environment, and a paragraph on my health. Like lots of love, Edward, kiss, kiss. And so my dad never replied to me, didn't reply to me. And my mum replied to me saying, okay, I'm really worried about you. I think you're going to die from synthetic proteins. And like to this day, I'm still looking for synthetic proteins. And I was like, where the hell are these things, right? And also, funny enough, my mum is not particularly religious. Like, she doesn't go to church, she doesn't read the Bible or anything. But for all of a sudden, she said, but animals are put here for us to eat. And I was like, well, that's new, isn't it? It's like, just play the religion card whenever you feel like it, right? Anyway, that's almost not relevant. But anyway, it wasn't good, okay? It didn't go well. And this was like my first like voyage into like advocacy, so to speak, and I was so demoralized. Anyway, flash forward to last year. I did a live debate on the BBC with a dairy farmer. And afterwards, I felt quite confident. I thought, oh, man, this is pretty good. Like, I felt like I'd done a good job. And so I thought, this is it. I'm going to tell my mum and my dad again. So I said, so again, messaged them separately. I was like, hi, Mum, hi, Dad, just let you know that I did this debate on the BBC this morning. You can watch it at BBC iPlayer online here. My mum replied, she was like, okay, cool, yeah, that's good. Like, I'll check it out. And then my dad was like, oh, we know all about you. I was like, what does that mean? Because I'd never told them about like what I do, my advocacy. I'd never told them about Earthling Ed, right? And I was like, anyway, whatever that is. And so I was like, oh, okay. And he was like, we know all about Earthling Ed, and we watched your debate live, and your auntie's a big fan of what you do. And he went, you're very persuasive. I thought, oh, damn, very persuasive, right? And he said, if you were, because my dad's a bit of a film buff, film geek, and he was like, oh, if you were Rocky Bilbao, the dairy farm was Apollo Creed, like you beat him, and I was like, oh, nice, okay, that's cool. But I was like very persuasive, and I felt like I just like jammed my foot in the door, like he was trying to like, and I was like, no, you're not going to break this door down. So like I slammed my foot to try and get like a little bit of a way in there. And so I thought, this is great. And so the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes it takes a long time to get to these points with like non-vegan friends and family. And it's like a little by little approach. And so it went from my dad like not replying to me, not messaging me, never talking to me about it, to saying, oh, that's pretty persuasive. I thought, that's good. And so I guess the moral of the story, so to speak, is that it is difficult. And I think there's a few reasons why it's difficult. And this doesn't relate entirely to your situation, but I'll bring it back. And so we look at like non-vegan parents. It can be insanely frustrating because we think, oh, we're going to go vegan, we're going to tell our parents, they're just going to get it on the spot and they're going to care. Well, my family never asked me, they didn't care about it, and I felt like they didn't care about me, and that's not necessarily fair of me, and it's not fair for a few reasons. And I think the first reason primarily is that, well, my family raised me to be what they perceived to be a good person. And so I speak rather generally because I understand that not everyone has that kind of family upbringing. But for a lot of us, our parents want us to be good people. And by that I mean they want us to be like upstanding, moral, law-abiding citizens, right? They want us to kind of integrate into the, I guess, the paradigms of a society that, you know, they want us to be a part of. I guess that's a very convoluted way of saying that. And so my family wanted me to have good morals and good values. And so when I turn around to them, like 20 years old, and say, hey, Mom, hey, Dad, I'm vegan, they don't just hear that. They hear like something else going on. They hear me saying, the way you raised me is wrong. It's a very subconscious thing, of course. I'm not directly saying that, but that's what they perceive. Because I say, well, I think killing animals is immoral, and so they hear the way you raised me is immoral. That's a really hard thing for a parent to hear, of course. And so any parent who changes when their child goes vegan requires such a huge amount of praise, because I think it takes humility and humbleness beyond belief to accept that potentially the way you raise your child is wrong and the way you've lived your life could be considered immoral as well. And it takes a huge amount of responsibility, and I think that that's not something we should be overlooking. And so that definitely plays a part in it. I also think there's some sort of weird kind of like false dichotomy or something where it's like a structure of command, so to speak. And so what you'd have is like parents teach their children, right? And so when a child then turns around and says, hey, Mom, hey, Dad, would you like to learn from me? That kind of like part of them is like, no, you learn from us kind of thing. Anyway, that's more of a societal, familial hierarchy more than anything else. But anyway, to relate it back to like family but also friends, what we have is a situation where we hold these people really dearly to us. And so it becomes really difficult to advocate in a way that we'd normally advocate because we don't want to offend people. And so if you have a conversation with someone on the streets, you obviously want that conversation to go well, but you can push boundaries a little bit more and hold them a little bit more accountable and be a bit more emotive potentially in the rhetoric and language you use. But when you're at home and you've got family and friends and boyfriends and girlfriends, you don't have that luxury because you don't want to argue with them. You don't want to lose them if they're boyfriends and girlfriends, and you don't want to push them away or cause friction or tension within your relationships. And so that automatically there's this kind of wall put between us where you don't want to overstep the mark and cause too many problems, which creates a little bit of a treading on broken glass scenario, right, where you just really tiptoeing around not to cause any potential problems. And so that makes the situation so much harder, right, because you can't necessarily always be forthright with them. So what I'd always recommend is try and get them to watch a documentary first and foremost. But 90 minutes is a long time to spare. I found this out. My stepdad, back to my family, right? Me. No. With my stepdad, right? I bought him Fox Over Knives 2.5 years ago, or even 3 years ago, because he type 2 diabetes, overweight, gallstones that were so bad the doctor said they're the worst he's ever seen. Also had a stroke recently. So there's a whole host of potential problems there. So only 3 years ago I bought Forks Over Knives, which is a documentary that talks about how a plant-based diet can help you with these leading diseases and illnesses. 3 years on, we've still not watched it, which is insanely frustrating. But the point I'm making is that 90 minutes can seem like a long time for someone when the 90 minutes is of something they don't want to hear. So try a documentary. If they don't want to watch that, then like go for something on YouTube that's like 15 minutes long. And there's like a repetitive kind of like assault of shorter videos, I guess, would probably be more of a poignant way of doing it. But I also think playing to their strengths, like I advocate from the moral perspective, a philosophical perspective, but at the same time, that doesn't always work for everyone. Some people are more interested in the environment. Some people are interested in their health and how to, whatever, be fit and healthy. And so I think you have to play people at where they're at. Now, that doesn't mean that we're somehow being untrue to the animals if they're not the centerpiece of the argument that we make at the time. Because I know a lot of vegans who went vegan for health and are now just as much ethical, maybe more so. I know vegans who went vegan for the environment and are now ethical vegans. So it's all a process, and so we have to meet people where they're at. And sometimes that might mean talking about something that we don't find necessarily as relevant. I mean, I'm absolutely grateful that being vegan is healthier for us and reduces all our risk of these things. But at the same time, it's not my main bulk of the argument because the animals are the reason I went vegan before I even realized about some of the other stuff. So I would just say meet people where they're at and advocate in a way that's effective for them as individuals and then progress from there. And just a little by little approach. Patience is key. And sometimes that could be going to a coffee chain, or not a coffee chain, independent coffee house, right? And then buying them coffee. Get them a soy latte or an oat latte. Or buy something from the supermarket, bring it home and say, let's try this, especially if you've got family. And so part of the expectation is sometimes that not that we expect, but we desire for our family and friends to buy products that they don't necessarily know the taste of, and they don't want to waste money on something they don't like. So give them a chance to taste it beforehand. The Impossible Burger is going to be in Burger King soon. Take your friends there, and if you can, right? It's so good, right? And if you have a bit of money and you're in a position to be able to do that, buy your friends the Impossible Burger, and they'll eat it and they'll say it's delicious and there's no difference. And then you can say, well, you can buy that every time you're in Burger King. And so it's the same. You get them to have a soy latte, and all of a sudden they're like, this is delicious. It's like, now you can always have a soy. Little by little, I think that's how we can get through to people that is sometimes harder to advocate forthright towards. It's a process, though. Frustrating, though, isn't it? I feel it. Thank you for your question. I hope that answers it somewhat so. Any other? Yeah, a lady at the back. If we pass it.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a vegan. I'm married to a man who said, "Oh, you're going out? I'll have a steak tonight." We have a dog and a cat, and since I've become a vegan, I look at the fact that I'm supporting the industry to some extent just by having pets.
Right.
And I wonder, can you address that? I mean,
I can.
should we just have no pets then? I've got them for the rest of their lives at this point, but you know.
It's the question, isn't it? Pets is an interesting one. Okay, so let's look at pets. So the vegan philosophy towards pets is adopt, don't shop, which primarily means don't buy animals from breeders. If we buy an animal from a breeder, we're commodifying them, we put a price tag on them, but also breeders do. It's a commodification in itself. Okay, so breeders we would consider to be unethical because they exist purely to raise animals to sell them for money. And so we say adopt, because another reason we don't want people to buy is because we have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of animals in shelters all around the world who need a home. And when we buy animals from breeders, we're almost sentencing these animals to being euthanized. And what we have is somewhat of an irresponsible society. And part of the problem I often find is that I will often say that we are a society of dog lovers and cat lovers. And I don't know if that's strictly true, because I don't know how a society of dog and cat lovers could have so many animals in shelters. And more importantly, how many people buy these animals from breeders, after a few months realize they can't look after them, and then give them away knowing they may well be put down. That to me seems contradictory to the notion of being dog lovers. Yeah, everyone classifies themselves as a dog lover. Anyway, that is more of a personal pet peeve than anything else, right? So we have all these animals in shelters that have been euthanized, and so if we buy from breeders, we're not rescuing an animal, a very healthy, a very behaviorally very adequate animal who just needs a home to go to because of the inadequacies of the raising of the owners beforehand. So that in itself means that we should be adopting. But if we're not breeding animals into existence anymore, it becomes somewhat of a difficult problem because obviously we're going to drastically reduce the number of pet animals that are raised into existence. And I think the word pet becomes quite interesting. And we say owner, don't we? I used the word owner just then, the dog's owner. Well, that notion of an owner is somewhat interesting in itself. One thing I didn't touch upon in the talk, but sometimes I do, is the notion of language. And so when I say about reevaluating our relationship with animals and their purpose on this planet, we have to look at how we refer to them and the language that we use. And one thing that most of us say, and I used to say it, and sometimes I still do and I catch myself out, is we call animals it. Look at it. Isn't it nice? David Attenborough does it. Drives me mad. There's that new Our Planet trailer on Netflix. It. I thought, hang on a second. It. What's an it? An it is an inanimate object. You look at your phone and you go, oh, that it is my phone. It has no sentience, no consciousness, but an animal is a someone. They're a being, they're alive, they're conscious. What defines us as a someone? The consciousness and sentience. The fact that we're individuals. Well, these animals are therefore, by definition, someones as well. The notion of an it denigrates them to property status, which is what society seeks to do. It seeks to devalue the lives of non-human animals till we refer to them as property. In the eyes of the law, they're property. In the eyes of our vocabulary, they are property as well. And so the word pet and the word owner also plays into this because it suggests dominion, exploitation, assertiveness, authoritarianism. And so we look at dogs, And this was quite traumatizing. Someone said to me this once, because we were talking about dogs. I said, our dogs are wonderful. They just unconditionally love. And I said, well, that's interesting, but have you considered this way? Everything a dog does in their day is dictated by what you want them to do. They go out to the toilet when you take them out. They're fed when you feed them. They have water when you feed them. They go for walks when you feed them. They go to bed when you want them to go to bed. And so they rely on you for everything. They rely on you for all of the necessities in their life. Then you call that Stockholm syndrome, where you become reliant on your captor because everything that you need to sustain your life is dependent on what they do and what they say. And so we refer to that as unconditional love, but actually potentially that unconditional love is just a form of dependency, that they need to be loved by you so that you give them what they need to sustain their life. And that's horrible, isn't it? What a horrible feeling that is. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I do believe that dogs can unconditionally love for more reasons than the fact that we dictate their entire schedule, but at the same time it draws upon ideas of exploitation and dominion. And so let's relate it back to what we were saying before about like breeding, and if we stop breeding animals, there's no more shelters. Well, that we only adopt from shelters, eventually there's no animals in shelters, which means that theoretically we have no more pets. Which seems quite sad really, doesn't it? Because who doesn't want a dog and a cat and all these animals in their homes? I mean, we love these animals in our homes. They are literally family members to us, and so it seems somewhat of an uncomfortable feeling to suggest that maybe one day this is the world that we live in. So we could look at it selfishly and say, well, it's not going to happen in our lifetime, so we don't have to worry too much, but that's a bit of a selfish way of looking at it. And so, well, is that the morally righteous thing to do? I don't know. I don't see another solution. If I'm against this thing, that's the consequence of what I'm against. And so to try and deny that this is the reality of what's going to happen would mean that I'm somehow fulfilling a form of commodification that I'm against. So it may seem uncomfortable, but isn't that the way that we live in our lives, right? We gave up animal products, or I did, because I didn't want to perpetuate this system. But it was uncomfortable for me. I mean, I didn't want to change my habits or my routines. I didn't want to stop eating bacon and halloumi. I didn't want to do these things. But I did it because I understood that there was a more important thing at play, that actually my life is not there just for me to hedonistically and egoically just do what I want to do, and that actually my life has responsibility and accountability that should be held upon it. And so actually, maybe this is an extension of the idea that sometimes in life doing what's right isn't always doing what we want to do. Maybe that's the situation. So maybe in the future there will be no pets. But then what about all these species of animals? And this is where I start to play devil's advocate of myself, because I say, well, Labradors and Alsatians and Chihuahuas and Pomeranians and Poodles, they're not just out there in the wild. And so we're almost sentencing these animals to extinction, which doesn't seem right in itself, does it? Because we domesticate these animals to the point, and then we basically control if they're around in the future. It's something I grapple with. The notion of veganism seems somewhat kind of like a progressive stance and a progressive step in the sense that there's always going to be these little things that we have to address going forward. And so I'm sure we could find some situation where we do have these animals in existence, but they exist somewhat more harmoniously than they do now. I don't know. It's an interesting conundrum. And another conundrum, maybe not related to what you were saying before, but related to having pets, is the notion of feeding animals to pets. I get asked this a lot by vegans is, I feed my dog and I feed my cat animal foods, and that seems somewhat contradictory to my values. And I know a lot of non-vegans sometimes do this. It's a rather, I think, disingenuous tactic where they say, well, you have a dog and you feed your dog meat, so therefore I shouldn't be vegan. Like, it doesn't seem to make sense, but they hold that as like an element of hypocrisy. The idea, well, you buy meat for your dog, therefore you're hypocritical to ask me not to buy meat for myself. And so I think that there's two big things to look at here. And again, it's that notion of necessity. And so dogs are omnivorous, so that means they survive and thrive on plants. And so actually dogs can be on a vegan diet, and that's not particularly controversial at all. It feels controversial, but in effect it isn't. But what about cats, right? Because cats are actually carnivorous. And so vegan cats sounds abusive. And I've had people tell me this before. Like sometimes they take this as a real stance and they go, humans can be vegan, but there's nothing worse than when vegans make their cats vegan. I think that's really abusive. And I think, well, okay, I absolutely see the logic behind that. And I think that is, in effect, could be perceived as being true. And so we would say that eating meat is a necessity for cats. The issue really is that they need an essential amino acid. Well, to them it's essential, to us it's not. To them they need an amino acid that's called taurine, or taurine, T-O-U-R-I-N-E. It's an amino acid that's only found in meat. We as humans don't need it, dogs also don't need it, but cats do. But the problem is the commercial cat food that we buy in stores is supplemented with it. Because the meat comes from slaughterhouses, it's the bottom of the barrel, the worst stuff. I mean, we as humans are given really bad stuff from slaughterhouses, so you can imagine what cats are given. Just the worst of the worst of the worst, which means that actually a lot of the nutrients in the products are completely eliminated through all the processing the meat goes through anyway. And so they supplement a lot of the nutrients back into the cat food. And so actually, taurine is supplemented in a lot of commercial meat-based cat food. And so the vegan version of that is the same thing. It's a product that's supplemented with the amino acid cats need. And so actually, in effect, there's no difference. It's just a perceived difference based on what we feed them. Now, some cats won't be vegan, and that's fine. We can't do that. We can't force that upon them. But it presents an interesting moral conundrum, right? And so I think there's a couple of ways of looking at it. I think it's just the most important thing is lab-grown meat will probably arise, and that'll probably take over the need for that. But also, if we have no pets in the future, it will cease to be a problem. It's like one of those morally grey, ambiguous areas that we exist in now, but if we follow veganism through as a moral and philosophical teaching eventually, it won't be a problem in the future. But it's an interesting one, isn't it? How do we look after animals? What do we feed them? And how do we do that? It's a strange one. And also, this is, okay, right? This is, I mean, how long have we got? Half an hour? Right, so this is like a real devil advocate thing for myself. And this is more of an open-ended question I don't have an answer to, and maybe if anyone has an answer, they can come tell me afterwards. If I proclaim that it's morally justifiable to take the life of an animal if it's a necessity, we can probably make the argument that, you know, if you're on a desert island, let's go to the desert island for standard. You're on a desert island and you have a chicken, and the only way to sustain your life is to eat that chicken. We could create a system that would be justifiable for you to consume that chicken. Now what about 100 chickens? Now 1,000 chickens? Now 1,000,000 chickens? Now 1,000,000,000 chickens? At what point does that one life not have higher value than all the other animals that are killed? Where's that line? I mean, it's got to exist somewhere, right? I think that's what I sometimes grapple with, because I say, well, it's morally justifiable if it's a necessity, but at what point does all that suffering not become justifiable, even if it's a necessity for the individual? That's where I don't understand. And so they say maybe we kill 100 animals, responsible for 100 animal deaths a year ourselves if we're non-vegan. So say we live to be 80, that's 8,000 animals in our lifetime, right? And so are the lives of 8,000 animals more important than the life of one human? Oh, it becomes really difficult, doesn't it? And then some people eat more than 8,000 animals. Maybe they'll eat double the amount, 16,000. Maybe some people will eat less. I find that really morally challenging, that area of like, where do we then say enough is enough? I don't know. But it is an interesting idea. That's completely unrelated, isn't it? Wow. The tangents tonight. Thank you for your question. Any other questions? Yeah, there's a few hands down here. Do you have your hand raised? The lady at the front here has had a hand raised before as well.
Hi there. Thanks for coming to speak with us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
My nephew is 11, just turned 11, and he was raised vegan, and he chooses to remain vegan, but recently his best friend told me that he's bullied at school for being vegan.
Yeah.
Have you spoken to any vegan children that you might have some tips I could pass along to him?
This is hard. I've spoken to a lot of vegan kids who get bullied at school. There was God, this is really grim, actually. There was a case in the UK, it's really sad, actually, where a young kid killed himself because he was bullied so relentlessly, and the kids at school like forced him to eat bacon and stuff. It's really sad stuff. And also, I was invited actually to speak at a school in a place called Lincolnshire, which is a really farming-heavy county, as we say in the UK. And the reason was because he was being bullied. And so they invited me to speak about veganism as a way to maybe alleviate the bullying. It's a real, there's not really much advice you can give. I mean, it's such a tricky one. I think it's such a, no, it's hard, isn't it? It's an indictment of our society that we find something like this worthy of bullying, like someone trying to save animals somehow warrants them being bullied at school. I mean, what kind of society are we in where that's an acceptable thing and it's tolerated? And that's one thing I can't stand is like it's tolerated by schools. Not all schools, I'm not going to generalize that, but I know schools that have tolerated it by saying, well, you know, boys are boys, right? Or even just the idea of, well, you know, if your kid wants to be vegan, it's like, well, come on, like, take some responsibility here. So it becomes tricky to kind of work out what a tip would be to help them. I think definitely having a solid family structure at home. You've got to make sure that they feel reinforced at home. But also, I think definitely need to go talk to the school. And if you can have a speaker come into the school, then that's definitely worth doing. Bullying is such a vicious thing, isn't it? Because there's no like easy solution. Well, there is an easy solution to it, but it's not an easy solution for the singular issues that it can arise from. I don't know. I'm really struggling. It becomes tricky, doesn't it?
Very.
Have you had meetings with the school?
No.
Will they allow it? Like a meeting? Yeah, do. Make sure to, if that's happening, then they definitely need to know about it. And I know that, and I don't know the laws here, but I know that in the UK, veganism is, it is deemed a protective belief in the sense of that you cannot be discriminated against at school or in the workplace. And I would imagine the school is an elongation of the phrasing workplace, which so you can't be, say, dismissed from work because you're vegan. You can't be discriminated against because you're, so like in the sense of treated differently, of course. So but I don't know about the US, and I would imagine that the laws here are not so good in that sense. So, no, terrible, right? So in the UK, you could take that stance here, I don't know, but I'm really struggling, I'm sorry. I wish I could give you like a real golden ticket out of this problem, but unfortunately, it's not so easy as that. I think it's just about he has to be resolute and have conviction in himself to know that he's doing the right thing, and that even though he's been bullied, he needs to understand that that comes from a place of insecurity within themselves, the fact that they feel somehow. I think a lot of bullying often comes from the notion of feeling threatened by someone, whether that's someone's intelligence and they get bullied for being geeky or whatever, or whether that comes from the emotional intelligence of not thinking of others as being objects for your disposal. And it's almost like a form of, it's almost like they can't somehow process this way of thinking, and so they see the other person as like an other, like someone they separate themselves to try and formulate some sort of bizarre backwards opinion based on this individual because they do something that makes them feel uncomfortable if they process. I don't know. There's some really dark psychological stuff, but it has to come from parents, doesn't it? It has to come from the parents. That's the only way it can, like, I think bullies must have must be some psychological thing from parenting. And so I can only imagine that for some reason the notion of veganism is a bullyable offense within the household. Maybe they're a joke, maybe the family farmers, the family hunters, they have some connection with it, I don't know. But these are things.
It is a rural area.
That's the problem, isn't it? You have to change schools, but again, the schools are part of the problem in terms of the perpetuation of education is problematic. And so I think, I guess in the rural area, these kids have been taught that vegans are threats, you know, or they want to close down the family, they want to take the food off our table, they're trying to destroy the economy of our nation, and all these, you know, these views that I think are grounded in some sense of logic when you perceive the environment these people exist in, but then they're passed down to children, and the children then bully because of it, which is dangerous. And yeah, it's about reshaping society's understanding of it comes from awareness, doesn't it? I'm sorry. I wish I had a more resolute answer for you that could just solve the problem. But definitely try and create a contact in the school, arrange a meeting, express what's going on, put some veil. If they won't listen, put some veil of discrimination over that to give it a sense of importance. And there is an animal defense league here, and I'm sure that they'll deal with issues of discrimination as well, especially children, especially.
Thank you.
No, I'm sorry. I really am. Yeah. The gentleman here had his hand raised before.
Hi, Ed.
Hey.
I also come from a rural family of hunters, and you know, I know a lot of people in my community who are that proverbial, you know, happy farm. At the same time, I'm driving 40 minutes to go to the city to do organizing for cubes and things like that. And I want to know, I see so much potential in a community with vegans and farmers, and I want to know, Ed, like, in your mind, what are some next steps for vegans and farmers? Because there's so much separation, I think, caused a lot by the media and things like that. Yeah. So how can we kind of, you know, aid in this progression as people that might have access to a lot of families that have hunters and things like that?
Sure. So I think it's a good question. I think there's somewhat of an issue where it happens. I don't know if I imagine it's the same here. I know it's happening in Australia a lot right now, and it happens in the UK where there's this kind of binary opposition formed, where it's like farmers versus vegans. But bigger than that, because farmers are producing food and they exist within a legal system, it becomes society versus vegans based on the fact that vegans are somehow jeopardizing the mainstream thinking. But let's simplify it to vegans versus farmers, and you create this really dangerous opposition when actually the two, I mean, obviously what animal farmers do is completely contradictory to veganism, but the notion of what they can achieve would be quite harmonious if we kind of had somewhat of a joining together. It seems somewhat. But okay, let's say the dairy industry last year, I said they were given $1 billion bailout, tax subsidies, right? Well, I mean, what that says to dairy farmers is that they're struggling, right? And the industry is struggling, right? And so the situation, this will be in their minds, is that, well, okay, the government's going to bail us out $1 billion this year. Presumably the profit's going to drop even more this year, which means that the government will have to bail them out even more this year. And then potentially that cycle would continue. And eventually the government's going to turn around and say, okay, enough is enough, like we can't keep doing this. And so that's going to be the back of farmers' minds. And so I think that there's this idea that, you know, vegans want to see like farmers like not with jobs, not feeding their families, like living destitute, and that's not true. I think when the issue of animal farmers becomes an issue of perceived goodness, in the sense, and what I mean by that is you're raised in a household, you're raised in a community, you're raised in an area where this is just normalized, and you're told this is fine and acceptable, and you bring yourself up to believe that. And then all of a sudden, you know, what you're basing all notions of good and bad on are entirely conditioned from the society and area that you've been raised. And so I think that good people can do bad things based on these issues of societal conditioning. And so I don't doubt that many animal farmers are probably good people. And by good, I mean like they don't intentionally set out to do things that would cause harm, but they don't understand the harm they're causing. So good people can do bad things in the sense of how they treat animals. I think that's an important thing that I found quite almost empowering to recognize that it changed that idea of us versus them. Anyway, and so theoretically what I'm saying then is moving forward, a vegan world isn't a world where the thousands of people that work in animal farming units are somehow sidelined to live out in a horrible existence. If we actually joined forces and came together, we could create such a better system. And so these industries, especially the dairy industry, but all of them will eventually become redundant in the sense that they will no longer be profitable. You know, we see red meat sales come down, pig meat sales come down, dairy go down, but at the same time we see poultry go up and eggs go up. So there's a system of fluctuation going on. It's not all straight and narrow, right? We've got some bumps along the way. But over time, these will somewhat equalize. And I think if we look at the rises, these rises come because of the decreases in others. So people giving up red meat because of the environment. And so they switch to eggs and chicken as a substitute because they perceive them to be more environmentally sustainable. People might reduce red meat consumption or eliminate it because of ethics. You know, they see cows as being very conscious, very, pure beings, so to speak. And so then they see chickens as being somewhat inferior. So there's a whole system here of why this kind of fluctuation, decreasing, increasing is going on. But eventually that's going to level out, and then the increases will plateau and then come down. So what I'm saying is in the future, none of these industries will be profitable. And so that leaves us with somewhat of a conundrum because these farmers will be out of jobs. And so I said $1 billion tax subsidies. That's on top of all the billions of dollars of tax subsidies animal farmers are already given. And what we have to understand is that the only reason these industries are in operation is because of tax subsidies. If you take away all the tax money the government gives to animal farmers, they do not operate. They can't operate. They cease to exist because they're not turning over enough profit. The industry itself is so unsustainable in the resources used and land needed and the equipment required that they just can't make money without huge government handouts from our tax money, which is somewhat incredulous in itself, right? And so let's propose a system where the animal farmers are still given these billions of dollars of tax money. But instead, they're given this tax money and they're told, this industry is failing, it's no longer profitable, there's no point investing in it, so take this money and we're going to help you change what you farm, or how you farm, or who you farm, from a who to a what, from an animal to a plant. So we encourage arable crop farming within farmers who are currently stuck in that animal system. And this is a really important note. This is an anecdotal story, but it represents the industry as a whole. And so there's a person who runs a poultry farm, a chicken farm, a broiler farm, so a chicken meat farm, I think somewhere in the southern states of America. And so they want to stop. They want to get out. They don't want to do it anymore. I think they work for Tyson or Cargill. But the problem is that they loan the equipment from these companies. And so because they loan it, they're always having to repay. But there's interest on those loans, which means that they're in a system of always been indebted to the meat industry. So they don't have any money, and they can't stop because they'll owe them loads of money. So they have to keep producing to keep paying, because the moment they stop producing, they get slapped with this big bill that they can't afford to pay. And so a lot of animal farmers, particularly within some of those industries, are trapped in the industry because they're constantly indebted to the big corporations that are loaning them land and equipment and all of these things. And so they can't get out. And so you have these farmers who wish to cease what they're doing, but they physically cannot. And that's, so it is exploitation and commodification. I alluded to it before, but it exists at every stage. And it's not just non-human animals. You have the humans exploited in farming, but then you have the humans exploited in slaughterhouses. And what many people don't realize is that slaughterhouse workers have some of the highest rates of mental health problems. Depression, anxiety, even suicide, drug and alcohol dependency and abuse, PTSD, and another one called PISD, I think, which is a form of PTSD, but it's when you suffer and get trauma from causing the suffering of others rather than being witness and having suffering inflicted upon you. And so they put slaughterhouses in impoverished areas where there's little to no job opportunity or any kind of reward for people. And so I visited a place called Stockton in California. And it was one of the most destitute places I've ever been. And we went there to go to a slaughterhouse, but a few of us, we were wandering around, and I felt so horrible. Because I was holding up signs like saying, it was like, see me, with a picture of a chicken, which is entirely, a good thing to do. But at the same time, there was a destitute, impoverished area. And I thought, well, who am I here for? These animals, but also these people are living in complete abject poverty. There's heroin needles on the floor, people smoking crystal meth down the streets, homeless people living in tents everywhere. And so this whole system is founded on exploitation. The reason the slaughterhouses exist there is because people don't want to work in them. You put a slaughterhouse in the middle of, say, Washington, D.C., what's going to happen? Well, no one's going to work there. No one needs to work there. There are an abundance of other available jobs there. So you put them slaughterhouses in an area where there's no opportunities, no one can afford to live, and you give the salary or the wage that's been slightly higher than everywhere else, slightly higher than all the other industrial jobs that there are going in that impoverished area. And you have someone who has a family to feed, themselves to feed, or maybe it has a drug dependency, I don't know, something that they're financially indebted to. And what choice do they have? None. And so they end up in these slaughterhouses doing a job that none of us actually want to do. And so when we point the finger and say, who would want to work in that place? Well, someone who has no choice. That's who. Someone who doesn't want to, but is forced to out of their environment and the system. Doesn't negate the fact that the animals, of course, the true victims in that environment, but at the same time, we should understand that the exploitation occurs on every single level. And these industries aren't just viewing non-human animal life as being somehow disposable, but they view human life as being disposable. They target marginalized communities, people of color, refugees, immigrants, and they use them to work in these places. And so in Canada, during the height of the Syrian refugee crisis, they said they could come and live in Canada. They could get given, I think it was a fast-track immigration visa to come straight to Canada. But you had to work in a slaughterhouse because people in Canada didn't want to work in slaughterhouses. And they had a complete absence of people working. There were jobs that were not being filled. So what better way to fill a job in a slaughterhouse than give it to someone who literally has no choice, who is fleeing civil war, fleeing abject poverty and potentially death, and put them in a slaughterhouse, where they then become the perpetuators of death and suffering. And you take someone who's already psychologically and emotionally scarred and you put them in a job that's going to amplify their emotional and psychological scarring. I mean, come on. I mean, when do we wake up? This is what frustrates me so much. At what point do we just say, what the hell are we doing? Stop it. I mean, at what point do we have to say that this is absolutely sick and outrageous before we actually do something about this? Trillions of animals dying. People in marginalized communities being exploited. Workers stuck in the jobs they're doing just so they can make money for corporations that don't give a damn about our environment or about our health. And then people turn around and say, oh, veganism seems extreme. What's at cost here? Our planet, our life, their lives, human lives, and the notion of buying tofu or buying spinach and kale and making a smoothie for breakfast rather than poached eggs is extreme. I mean, come on, this is how far ingrained we are within this system and how deep we are down this rabbit hole of manipulation that we somehow subscribe to continuing our own demise and continuing the suffering of so many. At what point do we wake up and just say, enough is enough? It's such a simple change. This isn't some massive thing that we have to do. You just go into the same places you've always gone and buy something slightly different. Or you make the same recipes you've always made. Make a mac and cheese, but make it with cashews. Blend some cashews with nutritional yeast and soy milk, and bam, there you go. You've got a mac and cheese. Make a lasagna, that's fine, but use something different. Spaghetti bolognese, use soy mince. It's not hard. And so this is what I find so desperately despairing. And again, I've gone way off tangent, haven't I? Because this was not related to what we were saying. But I guess the point of the matter is the world that we want together it's not in disalignment with what farmers want. They just want a world where they can make money, that's all. But we can give them that, give them those subsidies, incentivize them to change, help them get out of these predicaments they're in, and then we can foster a more harmonious world, including the people that are somehow against what we're doing now. This notion of opposition is somewhat detrimental. And I don't doubt for a second that it's also perpetuated by vegans who point the finger and say, you're an animal abuser. I understand the frustration, but it's counterintuitive. It's a disservice to what we want to achieve. If we can open up dialogues, then we can establish commonality. And that commonality is often grounded in some similar notion of animal love. So, for instance, I had a conversation with a dairy farmer earlier, and she very genuinely and very sincerely told me that she did care about her animals. And I believed her. She was wrong, but I believed her. And by she was wrong, what I mean is that she had a proxy version of love. She constructed this idea of love because it eased her conscience when they went off to the slaughterhouse. But deep down, she probably recognized that, but she felt that what she had was a connection. So what I'm saying is that we do care about the same beings. It's just their version of caring is muddled in with this kind of delusion of profiteering. And so the notion of care comes somewhat hand in hand with the notion of use, whereas veganism is taking the idea of caring and separating the notion of use. And so actually, there are similarities in terms of what we want. It's just they're confusing animal welfare as being some sort of form of animal empowerment, when of course animal liberation is the form of animal empowerment that we seek. So the point I'm making is that we can progress forward to a world together, but we need to have conversation and dialogue and reach a mutual understanding that what we want to achieve is something that doesn't come at loggerheads, but can be achieved quite happily together. But to be fair, not all animal farmers can change to arable farming. Some land isn't suitable. We can't produce crops in certain temperatures and certain climates. And so some animal farmers will be without jobs, without an alternative in terms of the direct alternative. So there's a couple of ways of looking at it. Firstly, we can create vertical farms, huge farms which could exist in any kind of building. Have them in cities, I'll have them in rural areas, it's irrelevant. You create a version of nature through the use of UV, through the use of aquaponics and hydroponics. And it's incredibly sustainable, removes any need for GMOs, fertilizers, pesticides, any worry for invasive species. And so we can create systems of vertical farming and give jobs to farmers in that sense as well. Or we can integrate them into a society. I mean, if we let's say we watch Netflix, to put this into perspective, this seems like somewhat of a strange comparison. But if we watch Netflix, then we've put Blockbuster out of business. But we don't watch Netflix and go, those workers at Blockbuster have to find a new job. We watch Netflix because it's great to watch Netflix. Or like when we go to a supermarket and you have those self-checkouts, right? And we use those, don't we? Who doesn't use those? But actually using self-checkouts puts people out of jobs who were, working on checkouts. Or let's have a situation where you say you're buying a car. And so the industrialized car system meant that we now build cars with machines, and so loads of workers lost their jobs. And so progress on a societal level can sometimes come at issues with others, but the issue isn't the fact that these people lose their jobs, the issue is how we deal with that situation. And so moving together forward means creating more jobs for more people in those environments, or in different environments that still mean they can sustain their life. Another point I was going to say is sometimes people say to me, don't you care about farmers' jobs? Like, what about the dairy farmers? What are they going to do? I'm like, well, hang on, don't you care about oat farmers? Well, I buy oat milk, so I support oat farmers. Why is a dairy farmer, why is their job worth more than an oat farmer? Should oat farmers all go out of business? No. Why should oat farmers go out of business and dairy farmers get other jobs? Like, why is it that the jobs of animal farmers are somehow heralded as being more significant than the jobs of plant farmers? I buy more plants now, or I buy different types of plants, and therefore I'm providing more jobs to other people and other farmers. How is that not a good thing? I think that's another thing to know. But, man, I told you 50 minutes wouldn't be that long because I waffle, right? Yeah, thank you for your wonderful question, really important. And yeah, the gentleman behind can go for the next one.
Hi, so my question kind of fits in well with what you were just answering the last question with.
Cool.
So my question is, if being vegan is not participating in the animal agriculture industry, shouldn't that be the baseline or like the starting point? And then wouldn't you say it's not enough to be non-exploitative, but actually anti-exploitative?
I would agree, yeah. I think, that's absolutely right. So being vegan is a passive action. Passive. It requires nothing. You just simply cook vegan food. It's not an active stance. It's a neutral stance, right? Causing suffering is a forthright stance, and advocating against suffering is another form of a forthright stance. But merely not participating is no stance at all. It's neutral, passive. And so let's see. let's take an example of you're walking down the road and you look to your right, and down an alleyway, someone has been abused because of their gender or their skin color. And so you acknowledge that, right? And then you just carry on walking. And so in that moment, you have not participated in the violence, right? You've not actively taken, you've not gone and victimized that person, but you also haven't intervened and stopped them. And so is that the morally right thing to do? Is it morally right to look at an action and go, well, I'm not going to take part in that, but I'm also not going to stop it? No. That's immoral. Like, if you see suffering and violence, you are morally obliged to intervene and try and alleviate that suffering and violence. And intervene doesn't mean like run in and, it could just be like calling the police. It doesn't mean I'm not saying you have to run in, like try and, you have to weigh up what that appropriate response would be. But the point is you have to take a response. Being ambivalent to suffering is immoral in itself. Silence is complicity, that notion of just because you don't partake in something, if you're silent about it, you're still complicit in that action continuing. You're still morally responsible for the consequence of that. And so we could look at veganism in the same sense. So we go, I'm vegan. You walk down the road and you look to your right, and now all of a sudden someone's eating a KFC. Now, I'm not saying run in and beat them up. I'm not saying that. But at the same time, you don't just then go, okay, I'm going to just get back to life. You go, this is wrong, okay? And now I need to do something about it. And so doing something about it wouldn't necessarily go up to them and talking to them. It means you start advocating your day-to-day life, because to acknowledge suffering, but then to not advocate or to try and alleviate that suffering is in a form of complicity. And it's also, I think it's almost, bear with me, it's almost more of a form of complicity. And so think of it this way. If a blind person is walking down the street, right, and at the end of the street there's a hole, and the blind person is going to walk directly into that hole, the abyss. Now, on the other side of the road, there's another person. This person can see, and so they're watching the blind person. Now, if the blind person falls into the hole, whose fault is it? It's the fault of the person who could see, but didn't do anything. And so in essence, I equate vegans as being the ones who can see. It sounds a bit culty, right? But bear with me. Drink the, don't drink the Kool-Aid. No. But what I'm saying is that we're aware of what's happening. Now, before I was vegan, I didn't know what happened to animals. And so when I say we are the ones who can see, what I mean is we are the ones who are aware of what's happening. And so if people are, unconsciously buying animal products, destroying the environment, killing animals, and that hole at the end is oblivion, let's say, it seems a bit dramatic. But if humans keep continuing with their actions, right, and keep eating the products they've always bought and contributing to the damage they've always contributed to, because no one's ever told them differently, it's the fault of those of us who knew but didn't say anything. And so actually, I think being aware and being silent is in effect more complicit than being completely unaware and unconsciously continuing, because you don't know. And if you don't know something, can you truly be held accountable for it? Probably not, because you're not aware. And lack of awareness removes some responsibility and accountability. But those of us who are aware and who do nothing are fully accountable for what happens. And so if we care about the animals, but then we just don't eat meat in our own life, but allow others to do so. And by allow, I don't mean like some sort of tyrannical, like take it from them, but I mean don't advocate, then we're perpetuating that problem. And so, yes, I agree. Veganism is a passive action, and passivity is not good enough, is the stance we take. When suffering is occurring, to remain ambivalent to that suffering is to allow that suffering to continue, and I don't see that as being a morally justifiable act. I think it's a great question, though. Thank you for your question. Yeah, cool. Yeah, got another question? Got 5 minutes? You can go anywhere you want. You can go next. Yeah. Oh no, sorry.
Oh gosh, that's loud. Okay, I kind of have two questions, but I think you might be able to answer them both pretty quickly, so I'm gonna double dip.
That's a challenge. Yeah.
What would you say to someone who actually does genuinely think that humans are on a higher level and that everything on the planet is for our use?
A quick answer.
Yes. Yes.
It's irrelevant. You can place humans at a higher value than non-human animals, but that doesn't justify exploiting them. What we have to work out is the reasons we exploit them. So we exploit animals for clothing, we exploit animals for taste, and we exploit animals for like entertainment. And so we can simplify that down to vanity, clothing, taste, sensory pleasure, taste, and then entertainment is another form of sensory. So all three of them are basically fundamental sensory pleasures. And so the question isn't, is the life of a non-human animal equal to that of a human? I find that to be wholly irrelevant. The question is the life of a non-human animal higher the sensory pleasure that we get from exploiting them. Higher than the, oh, I look good in this fur coat, or this piece of bacon tastes nice, or oh, I love watching animals jumping through hoops at circuses. You know, that's the real question. And so I believe that all animals have an equal right to life, in the sense of to not be exploited by humans when it's not a necessity. But I also don't deny the fact that if you look at emotional and cognitive capabilities, humans can have dreams and aspirations and accomplish things that other non-human animals can't. And so if you're in an extreme situation where you have to choose the life of a human baby over that of a mackerel, for instance, I'm not going to say that it's somehow a morally bankrupt act to save the life of the baby, because there are very logical and moral reasons why you would be impelled to do so. But it's an extreme situation where one over the other is not what we're faced with. And so we don't have an option of, do I exploit humans or exploit non-humans? That isn't, you have a third option, which is exploit neither. And so it's irrelevant, the hierarchy. You can have a system of hierarchy in your head. I don't think it's necessarily a great thing to do, but you can have that and still not justify being vegan. I don't see the... People often use like the religion, like, oh, God gave us dominion on I can't talk about religion, I've only got 2 minutes, but God gave us dominion, right? But the notion of dominion in itself doesn't necessarily equate to a physical domination. You know, parents have dominion over their children, but dominion fundamentally is more of like a responsibility. You know, we look at those who are weaker than us in society, and we see them as being warranting of more moral consideration. Children, vulnerable elderly people, marginalized people, people that don't have the autonomy or the capabilities, and then we could use the word privileges that most of us do. And so we view these people as warranting not necessarily more moral consideration, but warranting stewardship, right, or safeguarding. And so the notion that we then have, we take this idea, children need looking after because they're vulnerable. Okay, non-human animals can be exploited because they're vulnerable. But again, we've got a contradictory set of moral values. And so if we place humans at a superior level because of our intellectual capacity, our physical domination, that doesn't justify harming non-humans. In fact, it does the opposite. It justifies safeguarding them and stewarding them. And that's what I believe. I don't believe that we have a divine purpose. I'm somewhat nihilistic in the sense of purpose, but at the same time, I believe that the purpose we should assign to ourselves is the purpose to look after. I mean, those who have the power to help, that's what we should do, right? Why is it that we then use our domineering capacities and traits to exploit others? Well, I mean, again, it's just madness to me. It really is. I don't get it. That's my short answer.
Thank you.
Is there a second question, though?
There is, but Chloe probably would get mad at me if I went over time, so I can stop.
Chloe. I can do one more question. I know I talk a lot, so I apologize if... Okay, one more question. One more question.
I have been very, very many times told that veganism is a function of privilege. And I was just wondering what your experience with that would be and what your typical response is, because I'm sure you've encountered it.
Yes. First of all, I think a lot of the people that tell me this, I find it somewhat ironic. Often people tell to me, yeah, but veganism is elitist. Okay, like there are people that live in impoverished areas and they can't afford to be vegan. I'm like, that's a really valid argument, but you're at Cornell and you're paying through the roof tuition fees and that doesn't apply to you. And so my problem is a lot of people, and it's a lot of people with really great intentions. I find it quite, what's the word? Not disgusting sounds severe. I find it morally questionable when people use the suffering of others to justify them not being vegan. And there's a few food bloggers in the UK that do this a lot. And these are people, they're like, we're talking Oxford, Cambridge educated. Like, they're not in a system of privilege themselves. But then they eat eggs and dairy and stuff and say, well, you shouldn't be vegan because it's elitist. It's like, how dare you use other people's impoverishment to justify you? That's the first thing. But then let's remove the hypocrites and take like a more truthful and honest depiction of what that looks like. There's a couple of ways of looking at it. You can take the first route, which is to say the cheapest and most accessible and affordable foods on the planet: rice, potatoes, pasta, seasonal fruits, seasonal vegetables, canned beans, legumes. All these things are vegan staples, and they just happen to be the cheapest foods. And if you look at impoverished countries in particular, their diet is mainly plant-based purely because those are the most affordable and accessible foods that they can buy. And that paints somewhat of the picture, but it doesn't paint a wholly fair representative of the picture. Yes, it does in many ways, in the sense of if you have access to a supermarket, you have access to these foods, but then you have people that live in what we would classify as maybe like a food desert, right, where there isn't an abundance of these options, and instead you live down areas of just complete destituteness. But often coupled with destituteness is takeaway food, right? And this is another form of exploitation to humans. You know, there's a reason, and this is I think Dr. Milton Mills may have spoken about this in something, but he talks about how the fact that in really privileged, let's say middle to upper class white neighborhoods, you know, historically speaking, those are the places you're going to find the least number of KFCs and McDonald's and Burger Kings. And then in the poorer areas, in the poorer neighborhoods, that's where you're going to find the most fried chicken shops and the most takeaway shops. And there's a reason for that. And that's because they want to exploit people's circumstance. And so you take someone who lives, there's an area in the UK called Tower Hamlets. It's in London. And it's one of the poorest neighborhoods in the UK and one of the poorest in London. And what it has is the most fried chicken shops per area in London. The most impoverished area, like the most fried chicken shops. Coincidence? No. You take a family, and often these are single mother family households, and you have maybe 1, 2 children. The mother is working one job, potentially even 2 jobs to support a family. She doesn't have, you know, she can't go home and cook food or whatever, so she gives her like a little bit of money to children to go and buy food. And what are they going to buy? Well, fried chicken, because it's cheap and it's everywhere and it's affordable for them. And so that you have a system you have a socio-economic system that's facilitating this problem. And so I think part of the problem when people point and say veganism is elite is because the soy meat products are more expensive than the frozen meat products, which is absolutely true. That isn't the fault of veganism as a philosophical teaching. It's the fault of a socio-economic system that creates a scale of impoverishment and social injustice. And I'm not here to like be politically, fiscally preachy, so to speak, but it is in a reality of the world that we live in. And so what we need to do as people who have the ability to buy food, so that the ones who do have privilege, we are therefore even more obliged to buy vegan products, because what we do is we create an increased demand. The more demand, the more supply. The more supply, the cheaper the products become. And so what we then have is we have a system where the foods that we would see to be more expensive, like vegan cheese, vegans, which actually, in fairness, are coming down quite a bit and can be rather competitive in price. But what we do is we take them out of, say, like organic whole food stores, and we put them into more accessible areas because we've created a demand for it. We're seeing this a lot in the UK with like Greg's vegan sausage rolls. I don't know if anyone heard about this. There's this place called Greg's. It's a vegan bakery. Basically, we would refer to it as kind of like a working class staple. But that's kind of what it is known for. It's like food for the working class, the builders, you know, people who like sausage rolls and pasties and stuff. It has this connotation. But we're putting vegan food in these areas by making it seem like, by demanding it. And by doing that, we give people that are in lower income families and stuff more accessibility of options. And so I do think that you can really simplify it and say, look, these products are the cheapest products you can buy and they are vegan. You know, the most expensive products are the meat, the fish, and the dairy. That is objectively true in many senses, but it also doesn't paint a full picture and doesn't provide the nuances of a society that we live in. And so those nuances dictate that there are somehow fundamental difficulties that can sometimes not be observed by someone who lives what we classify as a privileged life. So the ones who have privilege have a duty to buy, to lower the price and to create demand and accessibility. But we also, this is where we can change subsidies. And so I talked about changing subsidies to help farmers, but we also have to change subsidies to help poorer people, because there's a reason why you can get a box of chicken for a few dollars, but a punnet of strawberries costs $4, right? There's a reason for that, and that's because these industries are subsidized so heavily the prices are dropped. You redistribute subsidies and you incentivize plant-based farming, fruits and vegetable farming. You bring down the punnet of strawberries to 75 cents, to 50 cents, whatever, and you make the prices of all these other products increase because that's a fairer distribution. And then all of a sudden you make healthier foods that are more environmentally sustainable and don't involve killing animals, the affordable option everywhere. But Burger King is a great example of like having a vegan burger in Burger King. It is now our duty to buy that vegan burger. Absolutely buy it, because we have to keep that vegan burger there, and we also have to tell McDonald's and Wendy's and everywhere else to stock vegan burgers. And it seems somewhat counterintuitive, and this is really the final point I'll make then, because is that a question of should we support non-vegan companies, because it seems like a betrayal. And the idea of going into a McDonald's and buying a vegan burger seems like the biggest act of betrayal, right? Because we think of McDonald's as being the absolute worst company in the world. They have a complete disregard for animal life, our environment, the Amazon, human life. They just have a complete disregard for everything other than profit. And we think, why would we ever as vegans want to give them our money? But ironically, it's because they're so bad that we have to do it, because it'll make them change. And we need to bring about that change as quickly as possible. And so hopefully in the future we'll have a vegan McDonald's, and when we do, we can go, nah, time for you to go, right? But we change them, but we don't forget what they've done. But the point that we have now is we need to bring about systematic change as quickly as we can. And that may seem like somewhat of a betrayal, but the animals don't care. And the humans being exploited, they don't care. Like, they just want the change to happen. And so it may feel uncomfortable for us to go in and say the vegan burger to McDonald's, but we have to. We have no choice, because we can keep buying from vegan-only companies, but we don't spread veganism quickly enough. And we absolutely have to make it as accessible and as affordable and as sustainable for everyone, so that everyone's incentivized to do it. People have the Impossible Burger at Burger King, and they say, this tastes just the same. And you say, well, if it tastes just the same, and it's better for the environment, and doesn't involve any animal death, and it's healthier for you, then why don't you always buy it? And then they will. And then that's the problem, in a nutshell, solved. No, it's not, but at the same time, it helps. So the question is, veganism as a philosophical teaching is not elitist. In fact, it's the opposite. It preaches a devolution of elitism to say that actually life is not different. Life is intrinsically valuable regardless of the form in which your life is taken or you are born into. And it's not as a philosophical teaching privileged, but because of the socioeconomic class that we have, it could be perceived as privileged to those in situations of severe impoverishment. But for anyone who's above the line and beyond, it's completely accessible because the cheapest foods are affordable. That's what I would say. The cheapest foods are vegan, not cheapest foods are affordable. That seems, of course they are, right? But that's what I would say. Cool, 10 past 8. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it.